Now we'll turn towards refined products. What are we seeing so far? And then, we'd like to remind you, please like, share, subscribe. We say that a lot, and we mean it. Your support is appreciated. So now when we shift a bit into the U.S., we always like to do that summary page, looking at finished gasoline, jet fuel, distillate, and residual to look at what is that demand metric. As we were expecting, we thought we were going to see a little bit of a roll on the average, but what made it up we thought was going to be a little bit different. So we were expecting gasoline to have a small increase, diesel, distillate to have a decline, jet fuel to have a decline, but we thought gasoline was going to go up a bit. Instead, it actually came down. But again, a small degree, pretty much within this confidence range. So the current demand levels are 14.193 million versus last week's of 14.673, putting us at an average of about 14.36 million barrels a day. And if you look about 2017 through 2019, you can see where we normally should be about, let's just say on an average at about, 15.3, 15.5. So we're about 1 million barrels a day short of normal. And that's just, as we've been saying, that's what we think is going to persist, where we're going to continue to see this walk between 14.1, 14.3, but let's be fair, we'll probably average much closer to 14.3 over the next 2 weeks and probably push a bit closer to 14.5, driven by gasoline, because we do think there's going to be that increase for gasoline as refiners push more product down into the system ahead of Memorial Day, which is something that I think the Gas Buddy data is starting to show, and we'll talk about that when we get into it. So the one thing that we just wanted to highlight is Taiwan CPC skips West Africa in the latest sweet crude tender, but bought 4 million barrels of U.S. WTI Midland for July arrival. So we have Taiwan, which is essentially skipping West Africa, and we're seeing a bit more purchases from the U.S., which is going to be, again, just another piece to what we're starting to see come into the market in general as we're seeing some of these movements. Now, when we look at distillate, distillate had a draw of 2.9 million barrels a day. And one of the things, like as we were saying last week, we expected to see draws still, but it was just going to be the rate of change was going to slow a bit. We thought it was going to slow a little bit more. Instead, it's still below what the draw was last week, but it's still at an elevated level. And the reason why we're seeing that is again, the focus for refiners remains away from the middle distillate cut and closer to the lighter distillate cut, specifically gasoline and those aromatics. So that's going to be the biggest piece. And just looking at yields in general, the production side of distillate remained fairly low, reaching what is really getting close to the minimum levels. So that's where you can't produce any more gasoline and any less distillate based on the current structure right now. So that's why we expect to see this hold firm, and we're going to continue to see distillate draw down as gasoline, which is again something that we've been talking about. That gasoline supply is going to be essentially flat. We see the demand. We believe the demand is there. It's going to be seasonally increasing, but again, below what's normal, but still increasing. But refiners are producing more, and we're still importing a lot, which is again offsetting some of that demand. And then when we look at imports, so imports for distillate, we're up 33,000 barrels a day. It's right around the 5-year average. It's plus 5,000 on the 5-year average. But as we've been saying, distillate is essentially done with the imports. There'll still be some residual. There'll still be some purchases, especially when you look at all of the Asian disti coming into the Atlantic Basin as well as gasoline. More of that gasoline will find its way into the U.S., especially PADD 5 when we look at where it's coming from South Korea and some of those other areas. But when we look at the Atlantic Basin, you'll be able to pick up some spare cargoes. Typically, we see if you go to the chart, you can see that U at the bottom, we typically start to bottom out and see those and start to see some steady builds. It's just right now, because the refiners are running at a reduced rate, and gasoline remains the key focus, and obviously diesel demand remains strong, and some lighter middle distillate side remains fairly strong, we're going to keep seeing these drawdowns in general, which again is going to be to offset some of those the gasoline builds. So then when we look at just demand in general, so demand for distillate is remaining elevated. It's going to stay elevated. It dipped kind of along the lines that we were saying because there is that timing delay. We will see it essentially go up based on just not just seasonality, but just based on what we're seeing on trucking. So again, that's going to be one of those small increases in general, but that's just going to be within the top of this range. So it'll be above the 5-year, but average below the top, and just work kind of within that component. Then when we turn to the internet with the truck stop, so just looking at the market demand index, you can see that the demand for trucking continues to go up. We're seeing it move more. And then when we look at pricing, the rates continue to just drift higher. And it's really just marrying with the increase in diesel pricing, which we're definitely going to obviously talk about when we get to the capacity of, okay, well, what is going to happen with diesel pricing? Are we going to continue to see this bleed up and out, which is essentially going to happen? I'm actually pulling up the rail traffic data because I forgot to update the chart here. But when we look at just the trucking side, this is going to remain robust. You can see it with load availability. Load availability is going higher again, which is going to pull that demand up, which is just going to keep diesel prices elevated, which again is going to keep those levels higher. When we just start talking about, okay, well, what is the pricing, and then how is that inflation being passed down, or price increases or increased cost getting passed to the consumer? So then when we look at the underlying rail traffic, rail traffic, again, it remains elevated. It's the versus 2020 is a hard comp, obviously, because of the death of all things when we looked at COVID. But, the one motor vehicle is going to remain, given this is showing an increase of 472%. The problem is we're getting more shutdowns of the product lines because Ford has announced some, Volvo's announced more. Those are going to be those key issues. Obviously, it's above where it was when factories were shutting down completely. But we're still seeing some of those elevated levels, while forest products, grain, anybody who looks at forest products knows that they're going in that one direction. Grains are going to stay elevated. There's a lot of movement, a lot of exports. Exports continue to surge. We have corn at $7. We have soybeans at $15.43. Again, everything is moving higher. And then on the intermodal side, obviously this number is big versus where it should be. But when we normalize it a bit, we're still 8, 9%, and then depending on the week, 11, 12% above normal, just because we still have these massive shortages in the inventory side, which continue to get worse. They, as we talked about in March and April, typically that's a low period, and there was a lot of hope, at least that we were talking about, that we'd get some catch up at that time period, and we didn't catch up enough. So there's still those residual delays, which we continue to see hitting at the level on the port side. So this is just taking a snapshot of Los Angeles, and you can see that on the week over week that the levels still remain elevated that we're expecting on the TEU side. And just an anecdotal story, and if you don't read G Captain, they've picked it up. Freight Waves has picked it up. There are companies that'll say, look, I will pay any dollar amount to get on that boat because I need this container ship there. And they're like, there is no number. There is no number you can give us that will allow us to do this because we physically don't have the containers. We physically don't have the space, which is why some of these issues in the supply chain are not going away. We were expecting that we would be much closer to the repair of the supply chain, where instead we continue to worsen. So at some point we will reach that bottom and start to improve. We're just not there yet, which is being reflected in the import of inflation, which is why we keep saying we're still at the tip of the spear as to what we're importing and those increased costs that, what I think companies are hoping or expecting to pass on to the consumer. When we look at just the weather expectations, you can see it's going to be fairly cool through the first 10 days of May or so. You're going to get some heat up in the south with the southeast, but again, when we look at this just means that there'll be fairly muted demand for air conditioning and heating, depending on where you are. Obviously, the south is going to get a bit warmer, so you'll have some air conditioning needs, but for the most part, it just means that there will be that residual decline in heating oil, which will pull a little bit of that disty demand out, whatever residual was left. But again, just kind of getting into a bit more of that summer norm. I should say spring norm. When we look at gasoline had a build of 740,000 barrels. When we look against the year over year, obviously year over year it surged. The better, the 5-year average, which again is still also including the increase from 2020. But even increasing that, we're still only 4.4 million barrels off of the 5-year average. And when you look over the last 29 years, we typically start to see a fairly strong decline in storage, and instead we just have this flat line. Here we have a small increase, but the increase is being driven by Pad 3, where you can see that there was a build of 2.1 million barrels, putting Pad 3 actually 3.6 million barrels over the 5-year average. That's going to be the one to watch because we don't see exports increasing anytime soon of gasoline into the market. This is going to find its way into the local area, but also onto the Colonial Pipeline going north into both either Pad 2 on the Mississippi up or on the Colonial into Pad 1. So this is going to be the one. And then when we look at Pad 1, which had a build of 440,000 barrels, you can see that's only 2.2 million off the 5-year average, which again includes the big surge of storage for COVID. So that's where we always want to marry it. And then when we look at blending components had a build of 960,000, which is only 3.4 million below the 5-year, which is leading to what they're targeting. The target remains make gasoline because that's going to be the demand driver. And that's where we're going to try to, the refiners are going to try to make margin. Then when you look at imports were only down 1,000 barrels. We were expecting a bigger decline, so that just means that there was some residual. We're 183,000 over the 5-year. And when we look at it on Pad 1, had an increase of 95,000. And even though Pad 3 had a decline of 76, it's still elevated against the 5-year by 86,000 a day. And that's where we continue to see some of this friction where the demand for gasoline, while Europe continues a path of reopening, they still have a lot of gasoline in storage, and they still don't have that normalized demand, or at least closer to what the U.S. has, which is why we're going to continue to see some of these exports from Europe into the U.S., especially because that ARB still remains favorable to go from Europe into the U.S. in general. Now, when we look at Gas Buddy data, you can see that the past week actually had a decent increase, taking us right to the high from the week of March 28th. Again, slightly down or right in line, and this is where we've been saying that we were going to kind of flatline here. We had that steady decline. We expected this increase. We got the increase. Now it's just going to be a little bit of a sideways move, and the week over week is going to be a little bit harder. We should see a little bit of a decline week over week based on the Gas Buddy data, but this number will result in an increase in movements through the system, which will show up in the EIA demand data. So U.S. gasoline demand as reflected by products supplied fell less than 1%, according to Descartes Labs. And then Gas Buddy data showed U.S. gasoline demand last week jumped 3% to the second highest level since the pandemic started. The first level was just below that March 28th number. So again, spike, small fade, and that's what we think we're going to continue to see. It's just going to be a matter of when do people fill up. Now, most will kind of pare back some driving just because they're going to save up and you're going to see a Memorial Day push, which we normally see. It's just going to be a matter of when, because when the holidays, falls always changes year by year, but we'll look at that in a minute. So then when we look at gasoline prices, up and out, so we're approaching $2.90. The year over year, I think is obvious, but when we look at the continuous trend higher, we continue to push towards that 290. And if you think about normal kind of increases for summer of 3 to 5 to 7 cents, depending on your location, just based on how it's made on summer grade, this trend is going to continue, especially if we have crude that's going to stay strong. You're going to have those gasoline prices pushing over $3 as we get through the rest of the rest of May, because we're going to kick off Memorial Day, kicking that off. The other one was diesel. Diesel had a big increase of about a penny, almost 2 pennies. We were expecting to get to about $3.14. We're at $3.14.2. So again, kind of right in that level. It's just when we look at both, we're going to see a general trend higher, over the coming few weeks, as again we continue to see the demand for trucking as well as rail, and then we just get that normal increase in just general movements on cars. Now, when we look at blending components, this is what we were talking about with, just kind of expecting it to go sideways. If we look at that 15-year, 10-year or so, the 10-year or so average, you can see that we kind of flatline here, small declines. This is something where the target remains to create this product for the beginning of driving season. Going back over the last 15 years, the demand levels have dipped below. And this is what we keep talking about, is that 15-year average typically pivots at this point and starts to go higher. So the comps are going to get harder just because we normally start to see that seasonality kick in. It obviously accelerates during Memorial Day. This is where we're going to have to look at, okay, well, where does Memorial Day fall? And you can see that average spike and then fade. That spike is Memorial Day, obviously. So yeah, that spike and then fade. It's just going to be a matter of when do we get that in this year, because it will happen. It's just going to be a matter of how far below normal does that spike take us, which is why we shifted a little bit and we look at, okay, well, let's take out the noise and look at from 2016 to 2021, and obviously taking out 2020. So we were expecting an increase to come in below the 2021 high, but again, we were expecting a move up. Instead, we had a slight decline, which just means that we're going to get a nice pop next week, which will take us closer to that, let's call it 8.959 million. But then when you look at the normal in terms of 18, 17, 16, you normally have these elevated moves coming closer to 9.5 million. And then as you get into the normal months of, you can see that normal surge going into the end of June, you're actually getting closer to the end of May, getting closer to 9.7 million barrels a day. So it's just, we're not going to be able to climb that wall. We'll see an increase. It's just, again, going to be at a relatively lower level versus seasonal norms, which is what we always like to gauge against, because we'll see an increase. So don't be surprised if you see it because it's going to be seasonally expected. It just won't be where it should be for this time of year. Then when we look at propane had a build of 470,000 barrels. Again, kind of that steady moves. We're expecting an acceleration to the upside. When you look against the 5-year, you have a decline of it's below the 5-year by 9.7 million. This is one that's going to start to creep higher. The shortage in plastics remains. The demand for propane remains. So we just expect this to remain below that 5-year average through really the rest of the year. I mean, what maybe we see an acceleration of supply, but right now, the trend is going to be well below that 5-year average, which we don't really see stopping. When we look at U.S. activity, you can see the steady decline of COVID cases, which remains that positive. The lockdown index has rolled back again, so we're actually going to be below 50 for the first time since I guess COVID began. Which is, again, going to be some of that net positive as we see a bit more activity, which, as we keep saying, is kind of the normal at this point. But when we look at, just what has changed over the last 7 days, as we were saying, parks are just going to be the thing to do because there is a problem with money. There is still people that don't have the funds, so they're just going to take advantage of the local areas, but they still will drive more. And you can see that transit stations have increased. They've started to flatline. Now we have JP Morgan talking about bringing people back, Goldman Sachs. So we expect to see that transit station continue to increase, which I think will take some of that expected additional driving for work kind of out off the table, but we will see some normalcy in that period of time as shopping and everything else kind of remains flat and work from home still remains the common trend. When we look at Apple Mobility, I think this speaks to what we are seeing where we've essentially flatlined here and we don't see this changing on any real way until we get closer to Memorial Day. The benefits that we've seen is a bit more activity in Italy. You can see that we've actually had that spike back up. But UK, Italy have kind of found this norm, and same with Germany, where we've seen a bit of a flat line. And just based on the data points that continue to come out of Europe, we don't see too much acceleration past the baseline that was set back in January. And now when we look at vaccinations, the one, we can talk about all the different ones, but the one for the U.S. is I think not so much a concern, but just something to watch. We actually had a big step back in terms of the vaccine doses administered per 100 people. And there's two reasons for that. One, you have a lot of people who wanted a vaccine who have already gotten it. And you had people that never really intended to get the vaccine that still don't want it. So as those people dry up and then the people on the other side are like, well, I don't really need it. I don't think I want it. As that merges, you're going to see those vaccination rates decline, which is going to be, do we see an increase in cases? Do we see cases just flatline at this level? That's going to be kind of one thing to watch. And, Biden has put out a 70% of adults vaccinated by middle of July. I think it's going to be a little difficult to hit just because I don't think 70% of adults want it, which again is going to put a little bit of a damper on some of those numbers. But I don't think that's a big deal. It's just something where you're going to see this, and I don't think it's a point of concern. It's just a point of, look, that we're kind of at that precipice, and now we're coming back down on those vaccination levels. Then when we look at jet fuel, Jet had a big build of 1.68 million. We're about 1.5 million below the 5-year average. The one we thought we were going to go sideways, instead we came down a bit, which just means that next week we'll go up a bit. The one thing that I keep saying is I don't think we take out that high that we achieved for spring break and Easter. It's just going to be in this range, and I don't see the range breaking up or down for that matter as we kind of just go sideways. We will get a little bit more demand. It just won't be, I think, as aggressive as people are hoping or expecting. So then when we look at throughput, this is why. When we look at departures, you can see departures kind of peaked and now starting to roll a bit. And the roll is really being impacted based on North America essentially going flat. Asia Pacific starting to roll a bit. That will accelerate. Europe and rest of the world, I think, go flat at this point. Europe is kind of in this mixture of starting to reopen, don't want to do it too fast. So I don't see that changing too much. So global flight departures fell 90 flights week on week. So again, really nothing. It's kind of it's not good or bad. It's just neutral. And that's where we continue to see. And that's actually happening again in the passenger side, where here you can see we're just there. We're just here. We're at 1.3 million passengers a day on average. We have our peaks and valleys. You have a little bit of a new high, a little bit of a low, higher low, but again, not within a margin of error. And just to be clear, when you look at 2019, we typically see a pivot up coming at Memorial Day. You get Memorial Day, then you get that push up, then you get that peak in terms of July 4th. As we continue to say, we think that we're going to be about 1 million people a day below normal. And that's so we will get an increase in passengers going through the gate. I'm telling you we will. It will happen. This will start to shift up. It's just the trend will be below about 1 million people below 800,000 to 1 million people below that 2019 number. And then when we look at seated diners, as we were saying, we thought we were just going to kind of flatline. That still remains the case. We think we just go flat here. Just to look at the breakdown in general, here you can look at open table across the country, across the world. Global, same thing. We think on the weekends you're going to be at about 10 to 15% below normal. Weekdays you'll be 20 to 35% below normal. But it's as Germany starts to reopen, that'll get better. I'm actually surprised UK hasn't gotten a little bit better based on the pictures that everyone likes to show us. So that the UK and the US is going to be one to watch. I think that we're going to see both of them follow the same rate, but that's going to support global activity just in terms of averages. But the one thing that we continue to see is jobs, and we'll talk about this in the econ show, the jobs data, again, it's positive, but it's not as positive as estimated. And that's where I think this friction point is coming in, which is why, we're not seeing people hire back as quickly. We already got a little bit of a surge, and now we're going to go steady state. And I think you're going to see this shift up again as we get to the other side of Memorial Day and into warmer weather. People start taking more vacations, especially as school ends, mid-June for most. So this is going to be one to watch for activity as we go through not just the rest of May, which we think is going to be fairly flattish, but as we pivot into what does it look like after Memorial Day.